Well, good afternoon, everyone. As you'll have seen from my name when it came up, my name is Steve Flynn. I am a member of the business and property team also, but I particular the specialism in sports law. So this afternoon, I'm going to talk to you, first of all, about what is sports law, and then more detailed look at what exactly a sports law barrister does for those who might be interested in it, and particularly the sports law team here at King's Chambers, and then hopefully go on to give some advice to anyone who's interested in pursuing this as an area of specialism, and hopefully, if we have time, some more general advice about becoming a barrister. Unlike with Mark and Matthew, I'm doing this session on my own, so I will do my best to answer questions as and when they come in, but if I miss any, I apologise, but feel free to ask them as they arise to you. So first of all, in terms of what sports law is, for a long time, there was a debate as to whether sports law was actually a specialism. If you look on a number of barristers' chambers websites, you'll see that a number of them still have sections dedicated to sport and the law. The reason for that is that sport is subject to the law of the land, whilst organisations such as FIFA, the FA, World Rugby, or UCI in cycling may seem all powerful and important for those who are interested in sport. They are simply private organisations that are subject to the rule of law of the land. So, for example, when the FA fined somebody £20,000 for acting inappropriately on the pitch or for some other matter, the person doesn't actually have to pay that £20,000, unlike they would if they were ordered to do so by a court. But if they don't pay it, then they won't be allowed to play football. So it is that interaction between sport and the law that gave rise to this issue as to whether actually sports law could be regarded as a particular specialism. That has moved on as sport has become bigger industry and more significant to the general economy. So what I would say in terms of sports law and what I'm talking about this afternoon is how the law interacts with sport, and separately how sports internal rules and regulations operate on those who are participants within sport. And that's very much what I do. So in terms of how the law interacts with sport, we're talking about issues such as a contract between a player and an agent or an intermediary. So in terms of that contract, the general law will apply, contractual law will apply. However, the judge or arbitrator who's coming to consider that case will look at it in the context of sport. It's called something called the specificity of sport. So any dispute over terms or how a contract was performed will be understood in that sporting context. We also deal with, as I say, the internal rules and regulations of sport. So if we take from a hierarchical system, which sports often operate in, we have FIFA, World Rugby, or the UCI issue rules and regulations as to how sport or that particular sport will be governed throughout the world. And that will be then implemented in a country. So for England, we have the FA, the RFU, and British Cycling for the United Kingdom, for Britain. They will implement those rules and regulations and also issue their own. So players, coaches, managers, owners, whoever's involved in sport will all be subject to those rules. And obviously, if they breach them, then they may be subject to disciplinary proceedings by the governing bodies, whether at a national or international level. So a sports lawyer will advise those individuals, those participants, on their obligations, and if they fall foul of them, represent them before disciplinary hearings, or sometimes if they say the rules are inappropriate and unreasonable, they will represent them in front of the courts, challenging those decisions. One of the most recent examples of that, for those who are interested in football, will have been to see how Manchester City challenged their expulsion for 2 seasons from the Champions League for alleged breaches of the financial fair play regulations and the duty to report. That went to the Court of Arbitration for Sport in Lausanne and led to a challenge as to whether the regulations were actually enforceable. So in terms of the issues that are likely to come up for a sports lawyer, they certainly, in terms of a member of the bar, they are first of all likely to be employment related. So we see lots of contractual issues between players and clubs or governing bodies. Also in terms of clubs trying to take one player for another, tapping them up, is often the way it's described, and whether there's an inducement to breach a contract often gives rise to issues in that context. Then we also have commercial disputes. So going back to something I said a few moments ago about disputes between players and agents, as to whether a player has moved from one agent to another and whether they have done so in breach of a contract. Also issues between sponsors, as to whether a player has entered or a club has entered into an agreement with a sponsor and whether they've complied with that, and potential breaches of that. Basically, falling out with each other over money gives rise to the second side of disputes in sports law. And then the other one, which I've already referred to in the context of disciplinary on-field matters, such as red cards or abusive language on a pitch or something like that, but then also off-field as to how participants can conduct themselves. So anti-doping is a big area in sports law, which gives rise to a significant amount of work. Betting and the regulation in relation to that is also another area that has given rise to a growing amount of work in this context. What's interesting in terms of sports law, unlike some of the other areas you've probably been hearing about today, is that you'd probably be recommended to go and read cases and find out more about them if you're interested. But unfortunately, for those who want to get into the area, you won't find many cases reported that relate to sport. And that doesn't mean that there aren't the disputes. There are many, but they are dealt with by way of something called arbitration. For those who aren't familiar with arbitration, that's a way of resolving disputes between parties in private. So rather than going to a court where anybody can come and watch in normal times or obtain a copy of the judgment, arbitrations are dealt with by the parties to a dispute, appointing a private individual, often a member of the bar or retired judge, to decide the case between them and keep all matters in private. One of my colleagues, David Caseman, Queen's Counsel, described sports law and what you see as being akin to an iceberg. In the press and in the reported cases, you see about a third of what's actually going on, and 2/3 are kept private by way of arbitration, and they are often the most interesting cases. So in terms of being a sports lawyer, you can also sit as an arbitrator, and many of the team here, including myself, do sit as that. So after a number of years of experience at the sports law bar, you will spend probably as much time as a barrister in front of tribunals as also sitting on them and making decisions on disputes between the two parties. So that is a slightly different aspect of this profession. Now I can see there's been a number of questions, and let me just check. One about Brexit, one about Lionel Messi, and one about sports law and employment. I'll come back to the Messi one and the Brexit one towards the end, because I think they're more general questions. But in terms of being a member of the business and property team at King's, but doing a sports law, is it possible to do sports law and an employment practice? Most definitely. That's very much how I came into this sector. I was an employment lawyer who also did commercial cases, and there was that crossover in terms of the issues that arose in sport. I was very interested in sport, and so started exploring the options in that context and moved towards it. These days, I still do a little bit of employment, but it's probably no more than 10% of my practice, whereas previously it was probably 90% of my practice. So it's certainly a natural crossover, and a number of my colleagues at the Sports Law Bar started out in that direction. So then turning then to what's it like as a life as a sports lawyer. I will tell you, first of all, it is not an uber glamorous life. Most of the time I spend reviewing papers, advising clients in conference, and representing people at arbitrations or disciplinaries. So it's not all swanning around with on private yachts or anything like that. There are benefits from being a sports lawyer that you don't get in other areas. For instance, disciplinaries are often held at sports grounds. So if you're in front of the FA, you get to go to Wembley. If you're in front of the RFU on anything significant, you go to Twickenham, or golf is at the Belfry. And if you do the level of cases which member of myself and other members of King's do, you sometimes get to go to Lausanne in Switzerland, which is where the Court of Arbitration for Sport is. It's described as the Supreme Court for Sport. It deals with most of the significant cases in a sports context. So you get to go out there and have an international element to your practice. You also do get some perks that you don't get as often in other areas, such as if you're representing sports people, you sometimes get to get in tickets to events or an invitation to the PFA dinner or something like that. But they are very rare and shouldn't be something that is a decisive factor in anybody who wants to come into this side of the profession. Also, anybody who wants to wear their wig and gown should maybe consider another area of specialism rather than sports law. I probably wear my wig and gown maybe 3 times a year, if that. As I say, most disputes are dealt with in arbitration, so we don't get to go out and appear in the wig and gown as much as other areas do. The other thing I would say is that you need a great deal of discretion to be a sports lawyer. I say that is the key aspect, and that can be very hard for some people who come into this area, because if you're dealing with high profile cases in an interesting area, you want to be able to talk about them. But sport very much frowns on those things. That's why arbitration is so prevalent. People don't want the business of sport and the disputes getting out into the public domain. So often you will be dealing with something fascinating and you will want to tell your friends when you're having a drink with them on a Friday evening. But if you do and it gets out, that would be the end of your career, or significant part of your career as a sports lawyer. So things very much stay private. But I think it's a fascinating area of the law. It cuts across a number of different areas. I can see somebody asking, obviously asked about employment earlier, and somebody asking about personal injury. Is there a similar crossover? Yes, so different elements of that come up occasionally in terms of assault on a pitch or something like that. The law in relation to that from a football perspective is most matters are within the game. So if you had a bad tackle and you were injured, you couldn't sue the person for the bad tackle unless it went so far out of what was expected within the game as to give rise to a claim in negligence. So there are elements of crossover with personal injury there. Is it a typical path? I'm trying to think. There are about 20 members of the bar in the England and Wales who practice in sports law. It's a very small area of people who deal with it regularly. I can't think of anybody who's come from a solely PI area. Lots of them have dealt with personal injury background. I think most who end up being sports lawyers are either commercial, employment, or criminal lawyers. So that's the aspect of it. Similarly, then, a question about whether there's a lot of advocacy involved, or is it more paper-based? Well, advocacy can involve being on paper as well. So I would say it's not as advocacy-based as something like employment, but it's probably more advocacy-based than it being a pure commercial lawyer, because the disciplinary matters do tend to come up for hearing reasonably regularly. I would say I would be in an advocacy situation, oral advocacy situation, say 3 days out of every fortnight. Now that mightn't be a full hearing, but it could involve a interim application or something like that. That would be on average. Some weeks I'll be doing 3 or 4 week trials, and other times I'll spend a whole month just dealing with one advisory matter or dispute, such as the sale of a football club, or a dispute as to international transfers and things like that, which will be very time consuming and more paper based. It's peaks and troughs in that regard. So yeah, so some of the other questions I'll come back to. I've not ignored them. I'll come back to them at the end because they seem to be more matters to round off on. In terms of the team here at King's Chambers, there are probably 10 members who would describe themselves as part of the sports law team, but reality, there are probably 3 or 4 of us who it's the large part of our practice. As I say, there's only about 20 people in England and Wales who deal with it, certainly at the bar, who deal with it on a regular basis. So you come up against the same people quite regularly, which leads to a collegiality. You get to know each other. You often become friends, and it makes for a very enjoyable side to cases. And obviously, if you don't get on with them, then it's less enjoyable. But most people are good people and interested in the same things you are. You tend to become a sports lawyer if you're interested in sport, so you have that common basis upon which to talk. The team here at King's, we are one of only 5 chambers ranked in Chambers and Partners for our sports law, and we're the only one outside London. Obviously, London is a large legal base, but in terms of sport, Manchester is, and the Northwest is also a big sporting area, particularly in football, but also British cycling is based in Manchester, and other sports are such as taekwondo and netball are also based in the area between Liverpool and Manchester. So it's a very strong area in this part. You appear in the members of Chambers and members of the team appear in many high-profile cases. I referred to the Manchester City case that David Casement represented Manchester City in before the Court of Arbitration for Sport. Other cases, for those who remember who Peter Beardsley was, or are Newcastle fans, will have seen that he was the under-23s coach at Newcastle, and a very high-profile player who was accused of making racist comments. I represented him in that before the FA, and that's in the public domain. Also, cases such as Macclesfield being relegated from the league were also dealt with by members of Chambers, including myself. So some of the cases are out there, and you'll be able to go and have a look at them if you're interested in. But as I say, a lot of them are dealt with by way of arbitration. In terms of the group, we're very active in terms of marketing and developing our expertise and sharing our expertise. We had an event last year out in Lausanne where the team went out and engaged with people who, Swiss lawyers who often appear before the Court of Arbitration for Sport, and gave a conference on developments in that area. We also hold an annual conference, which I organise, which brings together about 200 people from all around the world to talk about issues in sport and the future plans for and development of sport. In terms of becoming a sports lawyer, I've obviously seen some of the comments about crossovers. I've dealt with employment, I've dealt with crossover to personal injury. Question from Jack Medforth: if there's an area that you were interested in, we only apply to Chambers that particularly advertise that they do sports law, or if they do employment commercial, would that be an opportunity within that to specialise? Going back to Matthew's point in the previous session about you can decide how much work you want to do, you can also develop your practice in the way you want to do. That's one of the great benefits of the bar. Whilst you're junior, you often have work fed to you by your clerks and your practice develops in that direction. You can choose to go in a different direction. I've only been at King's Chambers for 2 years, having previously been at another chambers where they didn't have any sports law, but I just sports law team. Whereas I decided I wanted to do that, and given my employment commercial background, I decided to try and develop that. I started attending conferences, I started writing about it, and then moved into that area. Started doing pro bono work, so cases for free for those who couldn't afford legal advice, and developed it that way. The difficulty with that was I got to a stage where not having other members of a team around who, when I couldn't do a case, I had to return it to somebody to get them to cover it while I was on holiday or something. There wasn't anybody else in that chambers who could deal with it. So that's how I ended up moving to King's Chambers. So yes, you don't have to apply to a chambers that specialise in sports law, but there are real benefits from being in a chambers that does have that specialism and can do the things that I was talking about, of going to Lausanne and holding a conference, or having a multinational conference that draws people in, which will give you access to people who are going to provide types of work. In terms of one of the questions, do you also do other sports? I think I wrote down the other day, I wish I'd pulled it up now. In the last 3 years, I have done archery, gymnastics, football, rugby union, rugby league, golf, esports. So that's computer gaming disputes, and also things such as electronic cycling is one I have dealt with recently, tennis. I think there was about 30 sports I'd written down. Netball I do reasonably regularly, hockey, ice hockey, basketball. So there are a whole plethora of sports that you can deal with as a sports lawyer. The one thing I would say, and I think it has to be recognised, is football is the biggest game in the UK. It's the most financially lucrative game, and it has the most money. So in terms of disputes that tend to be fought, a lot of them are football related. And so that does dominate the market. So an interest in football, or how football operates, is useful, very useful as a sports lawyer. My particular interest is rugby union, and there is a lot of rugby union sports. But if you have a particular interest in a sport, it is a great way to enter into the sports law arena and start engaging through that, and then you'll often branch out into different areas. So one question, it's probably the case that some candidates are drawn to sports law because of a cool factor, but what makes a serious candidate stand out in terms of showing interest, commercial awareness? That's the next part I was going to come on and talk about, is to become a sports lawyer. You have to, you're likely to have an interest in sport generally if you become a sports lawyer, but you also have to be interested in the business of sport. You have to want to understand how it works and how it's governed. So for instance, at the moment, people may look at the stories in the press about Project Big Picture, which is a reorganization of football in England. And it's quite tedious, it's quite dry, and they might just skip over it because it's not as exciting as some other areas of sport. But you need to understand that, because it could be the most significant area reorganization for a generation in sport. You also need to gain an understanding of the commercial aspects of sport, as to, whilst it is about competition on the field, it is big business. So understanding that it's big business, and that there is financial pressures on sport and how they interact with decisions that are made by governing bodies is an important aspect. If you can go and work for a club, for your work experience with a club or a governing body or something like that would really make you stand out. Our current pupil, Matthew's current pupil, was involved in the Invictus Games, as I recall, and that makes him stand out as a kind of having been involved in organising a sporting event, and particularly of interest in terms of his understanding of sport, and will help him if that's the way he wants to go. I would advise anybody who wants to engage in this process to read about sports and the legal issues in sport. There's a website called Law in Sport, run by a friend of mine called Sean Cottrell, which is a brilliant resource for anybody who wants to enter into this area. It has a plethora of peer-reviewed articles about sports law. They also organise conferences. There's a big conference next month over 5 days where they will have leading experts from around the world talking about issues that are legal issues that apply to sport and what the future holds. If you can watch those, attend those, read those articles, it's going to make you stand out in that context. They also offer a mentoring scheme. So at the moment, I mentor a aspiring sports lawyer in Spain. They put you together with somebody who is in the industry, who will be able to help you, introduce you to people and give advice as to what you need to do if you want to progress in the area. So I think that's something that would help make you stand out. I'll come back to some of the questions. What would be the basic law surrounding sports law? Does company law and commercial law apply? Yes, as I say, it's how the law of the land will apply. Well, company law will apply to how companies are, the governing bodies and clubs are organised, but commercial law will definitely apply. You'll need a good grounding in employment law, some understanding of criminal law will also be useful. Some people specialize specifically in immigration as it applies to sports stars and things like that. So that's a useful area, a particular specialism that you could go into. But I would say that contract and employment law are very useful foundations there. So now coming back to some of the earlier questions, how do you think Brexit will affect sports law? For example, will it make a difference to homegrown players and regulations of transfer of in football? Football is an international game. Whilst Brexit will have an impact on English law, UK law, the FA has a significant power base within the UK and would be able to influence government to make sure it does align with the European rules. I suspect that it won't make that much of a difference, because if the FA or the UK system significantly diverges from that governed by UEFA and FIFA, then it will cause problems on an international basis. So I think it won't actually have a huge amount of impact. There might be some issues in terms of funding from central government, which is obviously an issue under EU law that might come in, but I suspect that much will carry on we will carry on much as we have done for many years, and things won't be that different. Do you think Lionel Messi could have been successful had he taken legal action against Barcelona? Very difficult to know without seeing the contract, but it seemed from what was being reported that there was a date included in the contract which said that he had to provide notice by that date. Whilst it may have been the common intention of the parties that that was intended to be the end of the season, and COVID obviously impacted the end of the season, if there was a specific date, I don't think he was likely to get anywhere with that. And the fact that he backed down so quickly is probably very indicative of that. But those are the type of cases that do come up, and often they are issues that need to be resolved by negotiation. Lionel Messi may be obviously a different level to most players, but employment contract issues come up between players and clubs regularly. And if a player wants to leave, it's often about assisting him to negotiate an exit on agreed terms. And those kind of matters come up reasonably regularly without having $1 billion buyout clause. Are decisions on arbitration legally binding? Yes, they are. The Arbitration Act 1996 deals with those, and as long as the requirements of the Arbitration Act are complied with, it is legally binding. They're also actually easier to enforce in foreign jurisdiction due to the New York Convention. So they are very attractive in both sports disputes and commercial disputes if there is an international element to the dispute. From a start to employment, how did you go about building a sports law practice? I think I've explained that by doing attending conferences, writing articles, and then, as I say, I started organising this a conference that I hold every year, and that is the way I've moved into it. By being interested is the real answer to that. If you're interested, people will help you, and there is a very supportive sports law network out there. I don't know how many of you use Twitter. I think it's slowly dying out, or certainly diminishing as the number of people who use it. But there is a very active sports law network on Twitter, with people providing comments and links to interesting cases and commenting on interesting events. And it's a very useful network to have on there. So I think that's another way of keeping abreast of what developments are, making sure that if you are applying for a sports law pupillage or an element of sports law pupillage, that you are abreast of what's happening in the sector. So I think that's all of the questions that I can see. And I think I'm 3 minutes over as it is, Matthew. So
that's great. Thanks, Steve. I
thank
think
you
we're
very
having a
much.
break now for until 3 o'clock when we've got Ben Williams and Rosie coming on to talk about employment. Okay. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody.